Be still. I won't hurt you.
Get away! You're a monster!
No, I am here to help,
Why should I trust you?
because I am not your enemy.
The air is thick with the scent of pine and burning ash as the forest transforms into a literal furnace. Elysia, a young woman fleeing for her life, is cornered by a figure so scarred and imposing she believes her end has finally come. But as the ugly prince reaches out his hand, a massive conspiracy begins to unravel, one involving a dead lineage, a crown of thorns, and a betrayal that will change everything. Stay tuned until the very end of this video to see how a man feared by the world becomes the only person who can give Elysia the peace she has long searched for. You won't want to miss the shocking revelation at the Northern Pass that flips this entire story on its head. If you love tales of high-stakes survival, redemption, and unlikely protectors, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss a chapter of this cinematic journey. The roar of the fire was a physical weight, a wall of heat that threatened to pull the very oxygen from Elysia's lungs. She lay paralyzed on the scorched earth, her vision blurring as the embers danced like orange spirits in the haze. Above her, the silhouette of the man she had heard whispered about in tavern ghost stories, the ugly prince, loomed like a mountain of iron and scarred flesh. She expected the cold bite of a blade or the crushing weight of a gauntlet. Instead, she felt the startlingly gentle pressure of a thumb brushing a streak of soot from her cheek. "Breathe," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very soil beneath her. He didn't look like a savior. His face was a mosaic of old trauma, the skin puckered and dark where the fire of a previous life had tried to claim him. But as his fingers hooked under her arms, lifting her with an effortless strength that made her feel as light as the ash in the wind, the terror in her chest began to shift into a fragile, desperate confusion. Thalric didn't speak again as he turned into the thickest part of the smoke. He moved with a methodical and patient certainty, his heavy cloak shielding her from the worst of the heat. Every few steps, he paused, his head tilting as he listened for the rhythmic clanking of armor or the shouted orders of the men hunting her, the shadows from her past who were now dismantling her world. Elysia clung to the cold plates of his breastplate, her fingers trembling against the royal crest she had thought was lost to history. She watched the way he navigated the inferno, stepping over fallen, flaming timber with the ease of a man who had walked through hell before and no longer feared the flames. To the world, he was a monster to be avoided, a ghost of a dead man. But here, in the heart of the furnace, his scarred hand was the only thing keeping her anchored to the world of the living. The transition was sudden. They broke through a dense thicket of blackened thorns and into a hidden grotto where the air was miraculously thin and cool. Thalric set her down near the mouth of a stone-hewn sanctuary, his breathing heavy but steady. For the first time, the coldness she expected from such a formidable warrior seemed to crack, replaced by an urgent, protective focus. He stood at the entrance, his broad back to her as he scanned the treeline for any sign of the traitor or the mercenaries who sought to claim her. Elysia watched him, her heart still racing, realizing that the man she had spent her life fearing was the only one standing between her and a circle of traitors. The silence of the grotto was heavy, marking a shift in her soul. She had been saved by the very nightmare she thought would end her, and for the first time in years, the freight train of panic in her mind began to slow. Inside the cool, damp safety of the stone grotto, the orange glow of the forest fire felt like a distant memory, yet the tension remained high-stakes and cinematic. Elysia sat on a smooth ledge, her breath finally slowing as she watched the massive silhouette of her savior. In the dim light of the cave, the flickering embers from his cloak illuminated the object she had barely glimpsed in the chaos. A heavy, dark crown resting atop his head. It wasn't the polished gold of the current regime, but an ancient, jagged circle that marked a ghost of a dead lineage, a symbol of a history she had been told was long buried. Thalric turned, and as he removed his scorched fur mantle, the full extent of his weathered and scarred appearance was laid bare. Elysia flinched, her old prejudices regarding beauty and safety flaring up, but the tender expression he had shown her in the woods held her in place. She realized then that his scars weren't merely wounds, they were a map of a violent, forgotten past, that mirrored the very conspiracy she was running from. "You are him," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The prince who was meant to burn with the old capital." Thalric paused, his rough hands tightening around the hilt of his blade. The coldness in his eyes seemed to crack for a fleeting second, revealing a hope for redemption that he had buried 15 years ago. He explained, in a voice like grinding stones, that he had not died in the coup. He had been betrayed by his own inner circle, men he once called brothers who had now become a circle of traitors, dismantling the realm from the shadows. His ugliness was the price he paid to save the very people who had eventually declared him a monster. The why of his survival became clear to Elysia. He was a man who had forgotten how to listen to the world, choosing instead to live as a ghost. But seeing her, a thin, shivering girl targeted by the same methodical and patient enemies who had ruined him, triggered a freight train of realizations. He wasn't just a hermit, he was the only wall left against a massive takeover. Elysia looked at the crown again, no longer seeing a relic of a dead man, but the burden of a protector. The stakes had shifted. If Thalric remained in the shadows, her life and the entire legacy of the kingdom would be lost to the men hunting them. As he stepped closer to help her stand, his imposing frame no longer felt like a threat. The outcome of their meeting was a shared realization. They were both outcasts, and together, they would have to confront the ghosts of their past to find the peace she longed for. The tranquility of the stone grotto was shattered not by the roar of the fire, but by the sharp, metallic snap of a crossbow bolt splintering against the cave's entrance. The peace Elysia had briefly tasted evaporated as the hunters at the heel finally arrived. Thalric was on his feet in a heartbeat, his imposing frame casting a long, jagged shadow against the cavern walls as he moved with methodical and patient precision to shield her. From the smoke-choked woods outside, the rhythmic clanking of heavy plate armor signaled that the burned men had found their trail, turning his hidden sanctuary into a cage. Elysia watched, thin and shivering, as Thalric's coldness returned, a tactical mask he wore to survive a high-level underworld war. Through the haze, the mercenaries emerged, led by a man whose movements mirrored Thalric's own, a reminder of the circle of traitors that had once dismantled the prince's life. The leader's voice drifted in, cold and mocking, promising a cleaning house that would leave no witnesses alive. The stakes were no longer just about survival, they were about the entire legacy of a man who had already lost everything once. "Stay behind me," Thalric rasped, his rough hands gripping the hilt of his ancient blade as he evaluated the traitor in his inner circle. The pacing of the encounter accelerated rapidly, shifting from the atmospheric silence of the cave to an urgent tactical thriller as the first wave of attackers rushed the mouth of the grotto. Thalric met them with a freight train of violence, his broad, armored shoulders crashing into the mercenaries with a strength born of 15 years of isolation and extreme paranoia. Elysia realized with a jolt of terror that these men weren't just hunting a girl, they were trying to sabotage the only hope left for the kingdom. Every strike Thalric took was a testament to his selfless bravery, a shield of iron and scarred flesh standing between her and a world that saw her only as a prize. As the mercenaries closed in, the climax of tension built, the grotto filling with the scent of blood and ozone. Thalric's emotional armor remained intact, but his eyes sought hers for a split second, a silent promise that he would defy his men and the world to keep her safe. The hunt had begun in earnest, and the only way out was through the very men who had turned the prince into a ghost. The adrenaline of the skirmish at the grotto's mouth began to recede, leaving behind a heavy, ringing silence. Thalric moved with a methodical and patient focus, his broad, armored shoulders still tense as he scanned the darkness one last time before retreating further into the cavern's depths. He knelt beside Elysia, his imposing silhouette momentarily blocking out the flickering orange light of the distant forest fire. The pacing of the night slowed, shifting from an urgent tactical thriller to an atmospheric and intimate stillness. "Show me," he rasped, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle the freight train of panic still racing through her heart. Elysia hesitated, her thin, shivering frame drawing back instinctively, but the selfless bravery he had shown against the mercenaries anchored her. She reached out, revealing a jagged lace of cuts along her arm where the thorns had bitten deep during her flight. Thalric's rough hands reached for a small satchel of herbs and clean linen. As he began to clean the wounds, the tension in the air shifted. It was no longer the sharp fear of a life-or-death situation, but a confusing, electric awareness. His touch was unexpectedly light, a tender expression momentarily softening the hard lines of his weathered and scarred face. For a man who had spent 15 years as a ghost, his care was precise and hauntingly human. As he wrapped the linen, his fingers brushed against her skin, marking the first touch that truly broke through her paranoia. Elysia looked at his downcast eyes, realizing that his coldness was merely a reliance on fear he used to protect a heart that had never stopped listening to the suffering of others. The outcome of this quiet moment was a profound transformation. Her fear of the ugly prince began to dissolve, replaced by a hope for redemption that mirrored his own. In this shared silence, the emotional armor they both wore started to crack. Thalric didn't pull away when their eyes met. Instead, he lingered for a second too long, his thumb grazing the edge of her bandage. In that climax of tension, the stakes became clear. He wasn't just saving her life from a circle of traitors, he was saving her spirit from the same isolation that had defined his own kingdom. The girl under protection was no longer just a witness to a war, she was the reason he finally chose to stop being a ghost and start being a man again. The flickering orange light from the distant inferno cast long, skeletal shadows against the cave walls as Thalric finally broke his silence, his voice a low rasp that carried the weight of a kingdom of ash. He sat across from Elysia, his imposing frame hunched as if the jagged crown atop his head had suddenly grown heavier. The pacing of the night slowed to a somber, atmospheric crawl as he began to unravel the massive conspiracy that had turned a prince into a ghost. He spoke of a time 15 years ago when he wasn't a monster in a cave, but a leader who trusted his inner circle. His flaw had been a reliance on that very loyalty, never imagining that the men he called brothers, specifically a former partner who mirrored the methodical and patient cruelty of the hunters outside, were dismantling his empire from within. The betrayal hadn't been a quick strike, it was a sabotage of everything he stood for, culminating in the great fire that was meant to be his funeral pyre. "They didn't just want my life," Thalric murmured, his rough hands tracing the deep burns and scars that mapped his face. "They wanted the legacy. They wanted the people to believe their protector had abandoned them in the flames." He revealed that the current circle of traitors now hunting Elysia were the same men who had faked their deaths to rule from the shadows, orchestrated by a man who had become a ghost long before Thalric did. Elysia watched him, her blue-green eyes reflecting a mix of fear and gratitude as the truth hit her like a freight train. The stakes were no longer just her survival, she was the living evidence of a betrayal that had lasted over a decade. Thalric's cold nature seemed to thaw as he looked at her, seeing in her innocence a mirror of the kingdom he had failed to save. "I chose the ash because it was silent," he admitted, his tender expression returning as he looked at the girl he had pulled from the embers. "But silence is how they win." This revelation marked a definitive shift in his soul, a moment where hope for redemption finally began to crack his emotional armor. He was no longer just a hermit hiding from the world. He was a king realizing that to protect her, he would have to reclaim a kingdom of ash and face the ghosts who had stolen his face and his future. The grotto felt smaller as the fire outside intensified, the heat pressing against the stone entrance like a living thing. Thalric stood by a natural basin of water, his reflection caught in the dark, still surface. He stared at the jagged map of his own skin, the burns and scars that had defined his identity for 15 years. His rough hands gripped the stone ledge until his knuckles turned white, a coldness returning to his eyes that was born not of malice, but of a profound reliance on fear and self-loathing. He believed himself a monster, a ghost of a man who had no right to stand in the light or protect someone as delicate as the woman behind him. "You should leave when the smoke clears," he rasped, his voice heavy with a flaw of perceived unworthiness. "A man with a face like mine, I am only fit for the shadows and the ash. I cannot give you the peace you seek." Elysia stood, her blue-green eyes shining with a mix of fear and gratitude as she approached him. The pacing of her movement was slow and deliberate, breaking through the atmospheric gloom of his doubt. She reached out, her hand hovering just inches from the weathered skin of his jaw, the very face he considered a curse. "You see a monster because that is what they told you to see," she whispered, her voice cracking his emotional armor. "But I saw a man who walked into an inferno for a stranger. I saw selfless bravery when the rest of the world chose to hide." Thalric flinched, his imposing frame trembling as he tried to look away, but Elysia stepped into his line of sight, forcing him to see her lack of revulsion. This was the beauty in the beast moment, a climax of tension, where the outcome was a shared hope for redemption. She wasn't just defending his character, she was defying his men and the circle of traitors who had tried to convince him he was nothing more than a scarred remnant of a dead lineage. "The crown you wear is heavy, Thalric, but it doesn't make you ugly," she said, her tender expression grounding him. "The men who started that fire, the ones who betrayed you, they are the monsters. You are the only beautiful thing left in this forest." The transformation in Thalric was visible. The freight train of his self-doubt slowed to a halt. For the first time, he didn't see a ghost in the water's reflection, but a protector. The stakes had shifted. He was no longer just fighting for his own survival, but for the woman who looked at his scars and saw only strength. As he finally covered her hand with his own, the tension shifted toward a quiet, cinematic resolve. He would not just save her life, he would find the wisdom to believe he was worthy of the peace she longed for. The fire outside had settled into a low, rhythmic pulse of glowing embers, casting a warm amber light that flickered against the cave's jagged ceiling. The air in the grotto was thick with the scent of pine resin and old stone, creating an atmospheric sanctuary far removed from the urgent tactical thriller of the hunt. Thalric sat near the entrance, his imposing frame silhouetted against the dim forest, his rough hands resting heavily on his knees as he watched the smoke drift toward the stars. Elysia moved to join him, her presence light and delicate against the harshness of the rock. They sat in a silence that felt heavy with unsaid things until she spoke, her voice a soft contrast to the crackle of distant flames. They began a heart-to-heart about the nature of power, not the kind wielded by mafia kingpins or kings with armies, but the power one holds over their own soul. Thalric looked at his scarred reflection in a nearby pool of rainwater, his flaw of self-loathing still tugging at the corners of his mind. "The world only sees the surface," he rasped, his voice reflecting a reliance on fear that had been his only companion for 15 years. "They see the burns and think the man inside is just as charred. I have spent a lifetime believing they were right, that my value was tied to the image I projected." Elysia looked at him, her blue-green eyes steady and unblinking. "True power isn't in how the world perceives you, Thalric. It is in the peace you find when you stop trying to meet their gaze." She spoke of her own life, of being a shivering girl valued only for a beauty she never asked for, and how that outer perception had been a cage just as cold as his exile. Through their wisdom from the streets and the wilds, they realized that they had both been trapped by the expectations of others. This conversation marked a significant shift in Thalric's cold nature, as he began to listen to a perspective that didn't involve tactical survival or shadow wars. He realized that his emotional armor wasn't protecting him, it was isolating him from the very redemption he craved. As the pacing of their shared understanding deepened, the tension of their pasts began to dissolve into a mutual hope. "Inner peace," Thalric mused, the words feeling foreign yet right on his tongue. "It is a kingdom that cannot be burned." For the first time, the ugly prince didn't look like a monster or a ghost. He looked like a man finding his way home. The outcome of their talk was a quiet strength that prepared them for the final trial ahead at the northern pass. The pacing of the night shifted from the quiet wisdom of the wilds to an urgent tactical thriller as the first light of dawn revealed the narrow, jagged path of the northern pass. The hunters at the heel were no longer a distant threat. The burned men had tracked them to the very edge of a crumbling stone ravine, their methodical and patient pursuit finally cornering the pair against a sheer drop. Thalric stood at the precipice, his imposing silhouette a wall of scarred iron and fur, his rough hands tightening around his blade as the climax of tension reached its breaking point. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and old betrayals as the mercenary leader stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the crown that Thalric still wore as a ghost of a dead lineage. The stakes were absolute. If Thalric fell here, the entire legacy of the kingdom would be extinguished, and Elysia would be returned to a circle of traitors. "Give us the girl, and perhaps we'll let you die as a prince instead of a monster," the leader hissed, his voice echoing the coldness that Thalric had finally begun to shed. Elysia, thin and shivering, but no longer paralyzed by paranoia, looked at the ugly prince. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man whose selfless bravery was the only thing standing between her and a world of ash. The outcome of their journey hung in the balance as Thalric took a step forward, defying his men and his own reliance on fear. He wasn't just fighting for his own redemption anymore, he was fighting for the peace she longed for. The ravine stand exploded into a freight train of violence. Thalric moved with a cinematic grace that defied his weathered appearance, his broad, armored shoulders crashing into the first wave of attackers. Every strike he took was a test run of his renewed will to live, while Elysia used the wisdom she had gained to navigate the crumbling terrain, providing him the openings he needed. As the last of the burned men fell toward the mist-shrouded depths below, the climax of tension began to fade into a weary, triumphant silence. The hunters were gone, and the path to the northern pass was finally clear, marking the ultimate transformation of a man once feared into a savior truly seen. The narrow, treacherous ascent of the northern pass finally leveled out into a high-altitude plateau, where the air was crisp, thin, and entirely free of the suffocating scent of wood smoke. Below them, the forest fire that had once seemed like an inescapable furnace was now reduced to a distant, smoldering scar on the landscape. Thalric halted at the crest of the ridge, his imposing silhouette framed by the first true light of a new morning. His broad, armored shoulders, once weighted by the heavy burden of a kingdom of ash, seemed to relax as the urgent tactical thriller of their escape finally transitioned into a profound, atmospheric silence. He turned to look at Elysia, his weathered and scarred face no longer hidden by the shadows of the cave or the visor of a helmet. The pacing of his breath was steady, reflecting a transformation from a ghost of a dead man into a protector who had finally found his purpose. As he reached out his rough hand, Elysia did not flinch. She met his touch with a tender expression that signaled the end of her paranoia. In this moment, the ugly prince was no longer a figure of terror, but the architect of the peace she longed for. The outcome of their journey was not a return to the gilded cages of their pasts, but the beginning of a life built on selfless bravery and mutual redemption. Thalric unclasped the jagged, dark crown from his brow, the symbol of a massive conspiracy and a circle of traitors that no longer held power over him. He laid the iron circle upon a weathered stone, leaving the stakes of the old world behind in the high mountain air. "The hunt is over," he rasped, his voice losing its cold nature and finding a warmth that mirrored the rising sun. Elysia looked out over the vast, unburned valleys of the north, her blue-green eyes bright with the hope that had once seemed impossible. They walked together toward the horizon, two outcasts who had survived a freight train of betrayal to find a sanctuary that didn't require walls or weapons. As they disappeared into the light of the new lands, they finally achieved the transformation they both sought, a life where they were seen not for their outer perception, but for the quiet, unshakable strength of their souls.